Carlos Mendoza is standing at the door of a humble home in Xochimilco when he sees a scene that breaks his heart. His elderly parents, on their knees on the soaked floor, desperately trying to protect their only belongings from a torrential rain pouring in through a broken window. Don Roberto, 78, can barely move, while Donna Eleanor, with trembling hands, tries to dry the floor with old rags. Neither of them knows that the millionaire son, who abandoned them 15 years ago, is there, watching everything. Carlos raises his hand to knock, but then he does something no one expected. He walks in without warning, and faced with his parents' desperation, makes a decision that will change their lives forever. But what he discovered in that house made him question everything he believed about success and family. Imagine for a moment that you've built an empire. You have everything you've ever dreamed of, but you suddenly come face to face with the people you once loved most, living in conditions you never could have imagined. How would you react? Tell me in the comments where you're watching this story from, and leave a like to support our work. The story I'm about to tell will move you and make you rethink the true value of things. It was a December afternoon in Mexico City when Carlos Mendoza decided to do something he hadn't done in 15 years. Return to the Xochimilco neighborhood where he grew up. Driving his BMW through the narrow, familiar streets, he felt like a stranger. At 45, Carlos owned one of the largest tech companies in Mexico, lived in a mansion in Polanco, and had a fortune estimated at over $100 million. But on that day, something inexplicable was pulling him back to his roots. The rain began to fall heavily as he parked his imported car in front of the small house where he spent his childhood. The peeling paint, the rusty gate, the dead plants in the small front garden, everything seemed even more deteriorated than in his memories. For 15 long years, Carlos had avoided this place, avoided thinking about the parents he had left behind after that terrible fight. As he walked toward the door, the memories came flooding back like a movie in his mind. He remembered Don Roberto, his father, a skilled carpenter who worked from dawn till dusk to support the family. Roberto always said that honesty and hard work were the only paths to true success. He also remembered Donna Elena, his mother, who sold tamales on the corner every morning before going to her job as a cleaner in wealthy families' homes. It was these same parents who sacrificed everything so Carlos could get an education. They sold the only valuable asset they had, a small carpentry workshop that had been in the family for generations, to pay for their son's university tuition. Carlos graduated with a degree in systems engineering and quickly showed an extraordinary talent for business and technology. But success came at a price. As Carlos climbed the corporate ladder, he began to feel ashamed of his humble origins. When he founded his first company at 28, he deliberately hid from his partners and investors that he came from a poor family in Xochimilco. He invented a story about growing up in a middle-class family and attending private schools. The lie grew bigger and bigger. Carlos moved to an upscale neighborhood, started frequenting exclusive social circles, and gradually distanced himself from his family. When his parents tried to visit him at his new office or his home, he always had an excuse. He was too busy. He had important meetings. He was traveling. The breaking point came exactly 15 years ago, on a night Carlos could never completely forget. Roberto and Eleanor showed up at his house in Polanco to celebrate their son's 30th birthday, but Carlos was hosting international investors for dinner. Shame and the fear of his origins being discovered made him make the cruelest decision of his life. Now, 15 years later, he was there again. The rain was falling harder and harder, and that's when Carlos heard a noise coming from inside the house. Curious and worried, he approached a side window, and what he saw left him in total shock. Through the fogged-up window, Carlos could see a scene that made him question all the values he had lived by for the past several years. His father, Don Roberto, was on his knees on the living room floor, his arthritic hands shaking as he tried to push an old bucket under a leak dripping from the ceiling. The man who had once been strong and proud could now barely move. Every gesture was a struggle against pain and age. On the other side of the small room, Donna Elena was also kneeling, her hands that once made the best tamales in the neighborhood now trembling and marked by age. Trying to dry the soaked floor with old, torn towels, she was murmuring softly, and Carlos could hear fragments of a prayer, asking for the rain to stop soon. What shocked Carlos most wasn't just his parents' physical state, but what he saw on the living room table. Even with all the poverty, even with the house falling apart, there was still a portrait of him there. A photo from his university graduation over 20 years ago, carefully framed and placed in the center of the table, as if it were the most precious object in the house. Carlos felt a tightness in his chest. How was it possible that after 15 years of silence, after the cruel way he had treated them, his parents still kept his photo in a place of honor? He remembered that terrible night when everything changed forever. It was December 2008. Carlos was hosting a group of Japanese investors at his mansion to close a $50 million deal. The table was set with expensive crystal, the dinner had been prepared by a renowned chef, and everything had to be perfect. That's when the doorbell rang. When Carlos opened the door, he found Roberto and Elena in the entryway, holding a simple chocolate cake that Elena had baked at home. They had walked for over an hour in the rain to get there because they didn't have money for transportation. "Son, we brought your favorite birthday cake," Elena said with a radiant smile, not noticing the look of horror on her son's face. Carlos glanced back and saw the Japanese investors watching the scene from the dining room. In that moment, overcome by panic and shame, he did something unforgivable. "You can't be here," he whispered, blocking the entrance. "Not now." "But son, it's your birthday," Roberto said, confused. "We came to celebrate with you." "I said you can't be here!" Carlos exploded, his voice echoing through the foyer. "You're wet, you're dirty, you'll ruin everything. Please just go." The silence that followed was devastating. Elena dropped the cake on the marble floor, where it smashed to pieces. Her tears mixed with the rain on her face as she looked at her son as if he were a stranger. "Carlos," Roberto said in a broken voice, "we just wanted to wish you a happy birthday. We just wanted to hug you." "I'm not that boy from Xochimilco anymore," Carlos yelled beside himself. "I'm an important person now. I have responsibilities. You don't understand the world I live in." Elena tried to step closer, but Carlos pulled back. "Son, we love you just the way you are. It doesn't matter where you live or how much money you have. You'll always be our boy." "I'm not your son anymore." Carlos screamed the words that would echo in his conscience for the next 15 years. "You're the past. I don't want you in my life anymore." Roberto took Elena by the shoulders as she sobbed. With the dignity that had always characterized him, the old carpenter looked his son in the eyes one last time. "When you get tired of running from who you really are, we'll be here waiting," he said. "Because a father and a mother never give up on their child, even when that child gives up on them." Now, 15 years later, Carlos understood the weight of those words. They really had never given up on him. Carlos stood outside for a few more minutes, watching his parents struggle against the rain invading their home. Guilt consumed him like a fire burning inside. For all these years of success, he had built a narrative in his mind that he had made the right choice, that he needed to shed the weight of his past to fly high. But seeing his parents like this, so frail and abandoned, that entire narrative crumbled like a house of cards. Finally, Carlos gathered his courage and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the small house, and he heard Elena's slow footsteps approaching. When the door opened, there was a moment of absolute silence that seemed to last an eternity. Elena stood frozen, her hands trembling on the doorknob. For a moment, She thought she was dreaming. The son she hadn't seen in 15 years was there, on her doorstep, soaked by the rain, wearing an expensive suit, but with eyes full of tears. "Carlos," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mom!" was all he could say before his voice choked up. Elena didn't hesitate, even after everything, even after 15 years of silence and pain. She opened her arms and hugged her son with all the strength her fragile hands allowed. Carlos melted into the embrace, all his defenses crumbling at once. "Roberto! Roberto, come see!" Elena cried out, her voice a mix of tears and joy. Don Roberto appeared at the living room doorway, leaning on a makeshift cane. When he saw Carlos, his legs nearly gave out. The man who had once built the greatest wooden structures in the neighborhood could now barely stand, but his eyes shone with a happiness Carlos hadn't seen in decades. "Son," Roberto whispered, and Carlos saw that his father had aged far more than he should have. His hair, once just graying, was now completely white, and his hands, which had once handled tools with precision, trembled uncontrollably. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Carlos managed to say, his words broken by tears. "I'm sorry for everything." Roberto approached slowly and with difficulty reached out a hand to touch his son's face. "You came home," the old carpenter said. "That's all that matters." It was then that Carlos truly looked around the house where he had grown up. What he saw destroyed him inside. The walls were moldy, rain was getting in through several holes in the roof. The furniture was the same from decades ago, only now broken and patched up multiple times. In the small kitchen, he saw only a bag of beans and a few old tortillas. "How have you been living?" Carlos asked, his voice thick with horror and guilt. Elena and Roberto exchanged a quick glance, the kind of silent communication only couples who have lived a lifetime together can have. "We're fine, son," Elena lied, trying to smile. "We have each other. We have our little house. It's enough." But Carlos was no longer the naive young man he once was. He could see the extreme poverty. He could smell the dampness. He could see that his parents were barely surviving, and worst of all, he knew he had the power to have changed that a long time ago. "Why did you never look for me?" he asked. "Why did you never ask for help?" Roberto sighed deeply and sat down in a wooden chair that creaked under his weight. "Because you made it very clear that we were no longer your family," he said, not with bitterness in his voice, but with a deep sadness. "A man has his pride, Carlos. We weren't going to beg for our own son's love. But you kept my picture." Carlos pointed to the table. "Because you may have stopped being our son," Elena said, "but we never stopped being your parents." Those words hit Carlos like a punch to the gut. Carlos looked again at the photo on the table and noticed something that made him feel even more guilty. Next to the frame, there were dozens of yellowed letters. Moved by curiosity and remorse, he approached and realized they all had his name written on the envelope, but they had never been sent. "What are these letters?" he asked, picking one up with trembling hands. Elena dried her eyes on the hem of her old dress. "Your mother wrote you a letter every month for these 15 years, Roberto said. Every single birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day, she would sit at that table and write. She'd tell you about her day, about me, about the news we'd see about you in the newspaper. You followed me in the press?" Carlos interrupted, surprised. "Of course we did," Elena said, pride shining through her tears. "Every time your name appeared in the paper for some important deal, I would cut it out and save it. I have a box full of articles about you." Carlos felt the world spinning. While he was building his empire, trying to completely forget his past, his parents were collecting his every small achievement as if they were treasures. "Why did you never send the letters?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Because you asked us to stay out of your life," Elena replied. "So we respected your wish, but that didn't mean we stopped loving you. Carlos opened one of the most recent letters. Elena's shaky handwriting told of how Roberto was having trouble walking, how the medicine was too expensive, how she missed cooking for her son, but there wasn't a single word of complaint or a request for help. It was just a mother sharing her life with a son she thought would never read her words. "Mom, Dad, are you sick? Do you need medicine?" Roberto tried to downplay it, but Elena was more honest. "Your father has severe arthritis and diabetes. I have problems with my eyes and my heart. The medicines are expensive, but we manage." "How do you manage?" Carlos insisted, looking around the dilapidated house. "Elena sells quesadillas at the market 3 times a week," Roberto said. "And I still fix a few things for the neighbors when my hands allow it." Carlos did the math quickly in his head. With their age and health problems, it was impossible for them to be making more than just a few pesos a day. As a diabetic, Roberto needed expensive medication daily. As someone with hypertension and a heart condition, Elena also had constant medical expenses. "You're starving." It wasn't a question, but a statement filled with horror. His parents' silence was more eloquent than any answer. Carlos stood up abruptly and began to pace around the small room. Every step he took revealed more details of the poverty they lived in. The exposed electrical wires, the glassless windows covered with plastic, the cracked cement floor, the mended clothes hanging on a line in the backyard. "For 15 years, he said, more to himself than to his parents, "for 15 years I lived like a king while you—" "Carlos," Roberto interrupted, "we didn't come into this world to be supported by our children. We came into this world to raise them and love them." "But I have money. I have more money than I could spend in a lifetime." "I could have." "You could have what?" Elena asked gently. "Bought us? Bought our forgiveness?" Carlos stopped pacing and looked at his mother. "Son, we never needed your money. What we needed was your love, your presence, to know that we were important to you. Those are things that can't be bought." In that moment, Carlos understood the magnitude of what he had lost. For 15 years, he had traded his parents' unconditional love for the approval of strangers. He had traded the emotional wealth of a real family for material wealth that now seemed empty and meaningless. The rain continued to beat down on the roof of the small house, and with every drop that fell, Carlos felt the weight of his past choices. He sat down in the chair where he used to do his homework as a child, the same chair where Eleanor still wrote her unsent letters, and finally found the courage to ask the question that tormented him. "What happened to you after that night? After I threw you out?" Elena and Roberto looked at each other again. It was obvious this was a conversation they had avoided having for many years, even between themselves. "Well," Roberto began, his voice careful, "at first we waited for you to change your mind. We thought maybe you just needed some time to cool off. We came back a few times," Elena continued. "We wouldn't knock. We would just stand across the street, hoping to see you. We wanted to make sure you were okay." Carlos closed his eyes, trying to remember. There were a few times, in the first years after the fight, when he felt as if he were being watched, but he had always chalked it up to paranoia or work-related stress. "After 2 years of trying," Roberto went on, "we decided that if you wanted to see us, you knew where to find us. So we came home and tried to go on with our lives." "But how did you survive? You were younger then. You didn't have all these health problems." Elena sighed deeply. "In the beginning, we could still work just fine. I sold food at the market. Your father did carpentry jobs. But as we got older—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Carlos understood. The harsh reality was that elderly poor people in Mexico had few options when their health began to fail. "There were some very difficult times," Roberto admitted, "especially when Elena had her first heart attack 3 years ago. The public hospital. Well, you know how it is." Carlos knew exactly how it was. The public health system was overwhelmed, treatments were slow, and medicine was scarce. For people without resources, it was nearly impossible to receive proper care. How did you pay for the hospital? We sold some things, Elena said vaguely. What things? Roberto hesitated before answering. The carpentry workshop I had set up in the backyard, the tools my father left me, some jewelry Elena inherited from her mother. Carlos felt as if he had been punched. Those were the only things of value the family owned, the only physical connections they had to their own families and histories. And even that wasn't enough, Roberto continued. We had to borrow money from some neighbors. We still owe part of that debt. How much? Carlos asked immediately. Carlos, no. Elena tried to protest. How much? He insisted. 15,000 pesos, Roberto answered reluctantly. Carlos almost laughed, but not from joy. 15,000 pesos. To him, that was the equivalent of what he spent on dinner at a fancy restaurant. For his parents, it was a debt that had been tormenting them for 3 years. And why did you never come to me? Not even in an emergency, not even when Mum's life was at risk? This time, Roberto answered more firmly. Because you said we were no longer your family, and we respected that. We would rather live with dignity in poverty than beg from someone who was ashamed of us. But I'm your son. You were our son, Elena corrected gently. The night you threw us out of your house, you made it very clear that you had chosen a different world from ours. In that moment, Carlos realized something that hit him like a bolt of lightning. For all these years, he had blamed his parents for not trying to reconnect with him, but the truth was, he was the one who had built insurmountable walls around himself. Carlos got up from the chair and walked to the broken window, watching the rain that continued to fall. The constant sound of the drops hitting the wet floor of the house seemed to echo the chaos he felt in his heart. For 15 years, he had constructed a narrative where he was the victim, the son who had to make tough choices to get ahead in life. But now, seeing reality through the eyes of a mature man, he understood that he had been the tormentor of his own family. I saw your interview on television 6 months ago, Elena said softly, breaking the silence. You were talking about social responsibility, about how successful business people should give back to the community. Carlos turned to her, confused. You talked about a project to build homes for families in need in Xochimilco, Elena continued, and I thought, my son is helping people from our neighborhood. I felt so proud. The irony of the situation hit Carlos like a ton of bricks. He had launched a social housing project less than 2 kilometers from his parents' house, helping strangers while his own parents lived in deplorable conditions. You knew I was building houses nearby? Of course, Roberto said. We passed by the construction site several times. Elena would always stop to look and say, our boy is doing something good for people. Did you ever think of showing up there, of looking for me? Elena shook her head sadly. Carlos, you built a very high wall around your heart. We weren't going to try to tear it down in front of your employees and journalists. If you wanted to see us, you knew where we were. In that moment, Carlos made a decision that would change everything. He pulled his phone from his pocket and started making calls. Hello, Rivera, it's Carlos. I need you to come to Xochimilco right now with a team of engineers and construction workers. No, it can't wait until Monday. I need it to be today. Yes, I know it's raining, but it's an emergency. Elena and Roberto watched, confused, as Carlos made call after call. Dr. Martinez, Carlos Mendoza, I need you to make a house call right now. Yes, I know it's Saturday afternoon, but I'll pay triple your rate. Bring all the diagnostic equipment you can. Carlos, what are you doing? Elena asked. "I'm doing what I should have done 15 years ago," he replied, dialing another number. "Marquez, I need you here with a truck full of construction materials, all top quality." "No, it's not for the company. It's personal." For 2 hours, the small living room of the Mendoza home transformed into a command center. Carlos coordinated teams, approved budgets, organized schedules. His parents watched in silence, still trying to process what was happening. The first person to arrive was Dr. Martinez, Carlos's private physician, carrying a complete medical bag and a portable EKG machine. "Doctor, these are my parents, Roberto and Elena Mendoza," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need you to give them a full checkup and tell me exactly what treatments and medications they need." While the doctor examined his parents, the engineers and architects arrived. Carlos took them on a tour of the house, pointing out every problem: the leaky roof, the precarious electrical wiring, the leaking plumbing, the moldy walls. "I want this house completely renovated," he instructed them. "I want the best of everything: new electrical system, new plumbing, a waterproofed roof, new floors, new furniture. And I want it done in the shortest time possible." "Mr. Mendoza," said the chief engineer, "a complete renovation of this scale will take at least 2 months. "Then you have 1 month." "Oh," Carlos replied. "And in the meantime, my parents will stay somewhere suitable." Roberto tried to protest. "Carlos, this is too expensive. You don't have to." "Dad," Carlos interrupted, "for 15 years I spent fortunes trying to impress people who meant nothing to me. Now I'm going to spend whatever it takes to take care of the people who mean everything." 3 months later, Carlos was standing at the same door where it all began, but this time the scene was completely different. The small house in Xochimilco had been transformed into a comfortable modern home, maintaining its original charm, but equipped with everything Elena and Roberto needed to live with dignity and health. Dr. Martinez had correctly diagnosed all of Carlos's parents' medical conditions and prescribed the proper treatment. Roberto now took state-of-the-art medication for his arthritis and diabetes, while Elena had undergone a minor heart procedure that completely changed her quality of life. They both moved with more ease and had started smiling frequently again. But the biggest change wasn't in the house or their physical health. It was in the relationship between father, mother, and son. Carlos had done something he hadn't done in decades. He started visiting his parents every Sunday, not as the important executive he was during the week, but as the son who had been raised at that wooden table, eating Elena's tamales and listening to Roberto's carpentry stories. On that particular Sunday, Carlos had arrived early for a special lunch. For the first time in 15 years, the three of them were going to celebrate his 46th birthday together. "Son, are you sure you don't want to have the party at your mansion?" Elena asked, adjusting the new tablecloth. "Mom," Carlos smiled, helping her set the table, "I've learned that home isn't the most expensive or beautiful place. Home is where the people who truly love us are." Roberto walked into the room, carrying the chocolate cake Elena had baked. The same kind of cake that had fallen on the marble floor 15 years earlier. "This cake has a special flavor," the old carpenter said. "It tastes like a reunited family." As Elena lit the candles, Carlos looked around the room. The photo of his graduation was still on the table, but now it was surrounded by dozens of other photos. Carlos as a child playing in the yard, a young Elena and Roberto, recent pictures of the three of them together, moments from the last 3 months that documented the rebuilding of a family. "Before you make a wish," Elena said, "I want to tell you something. For all those years you were away, I never stopped making the same request in my prayers, that one day you would come home, not to give us money or expensive things, but to be our son again." Carlos felt tears welling up. And I spent 15 years thinking that success meant having more money, more recognition, more power, he replied. But you too taught me that the only wealth that truly matters is the love of family. Roberto placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You know what's most beautiful about this whole story. You could have been angry with us for keeping those letters, for spying on you through the newspapers, but instead you understood that we did it out of love. And you could have been angry with us for being poor, for not having the education you have, Elena added. But you understood that love has nothing to do with social class or money. Carlos blew out the candles and made his wish in silence that he would never again forget the lessons he had learned in these last few months. After lunch, while helping Elena with the dishes, Carlos noticed something that made him smile. Outside the kitchen window, some neighbors walked by and greeted Elena warmly. She had gone back to selling quesadillas at the market, not out of financial need, but because she enjoyed the social interaction and it made her feel useful. "Mom, you don't have to work anymore," Carlos said. "Son," she replied, drying a plate, "work isn't about necessity, it's about purpose. You can give me all the money in the world, but you can't give me the joy of doing something I love." That afternoon, Carlos understood the final lesson his parents had to teach him, that true wealth isn't just about having enough to live well, but about continuing to find purpose and joy in the simple things in life. And you, watching this story, have you ever stopped to think about who the most important people in your life are? How often do we let pride or the rush of daily life push us away from those who truly matter? Tell me in the comments, when was the last time you said, "I love you" to your parents? Leave a like if this story touched you and subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this one. Next week, I'll tell the story of a woman who discovered a secret about her husband that completely changed her life, and what she did will surprise you. Until then.